I remember for me, I was a kid in the 80s, as I've mentioned many times. It was those three Halloween films. And I remember a time when Halloween 4 hadn't been released yet. And so it would always be the first Halloween films for me. So Halloween, and then Halloween 2, and then Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. So those were very essential for me growing up. And they were in the VHS days, and they were rentals. And in particular, I think Halloween 2, because of its gore, relatively speaking, as it showed a lot more of the violence and the gore than, say, Halloween did. Not to say that Halloween is any less violent in terms of what happens to the characters, but in terms of what's actually shown, as you know, the sequel, Halloween 2, does reveal a lot more in terms of the splatter and the gore. And so that stuff really scared me as a kid. And so even now, there's that whole cliche that's often used when people are talking, say, about Doctor Who episodes shown on TV, the scary ones, hiding behind the couch. And I actually remember, I'd be hiding. It would be those things where, how people, it's not just hiding behind the couch, but it's also closing your eyes and going like this with your ears because of the jump scares and the sounds. And so I would so intently put my fingers in my ears and plug them up and go like this, so never to be able to hear what it was, but then kind of peek, but then still be so scared. And that's what it was like for me watching Halloween 2 many years ago when I was quite young. And it was very scary, and there was a lot of intense bloody stuff that was going on, and there was also a lot of interesting things going on as well. For instance, remember when Laurie is hiding in the car, and then she's essentially injured and quite exhausted, and so she can't quite get to her feet immediately, and she is just crawling, and she suddenly she sees Dr. Loomis and the marshal walk into the hospital like that, and she's trying to scream and trying to get their attention, but she can't get the sound out of her mouth. And then suddenly, as they walk in, she starts to scream, "Help me! Help me!" And that's always a frustrating scene for me, because oh my goodness, had she just been able to scream just a few seconds earlier, it would have saved her a lot of anxiety, which had occurred moments after when Michael finds her and then does that thing with the parking lot there. And so, that always perplexed me. And also, I love Halloween. I love Halloween 2. I love Jamie Lee Curtis, and I am one of her many fans. She has so many, and I think she's great, fantastic. But the wig, right? The wig in Halloween 2, it's very noticeable and very jarring. It was for me when I was a kid, too. So so much so that it was quite a miracle that Michael was able to recognize her as he was able to, because the wig is actually quite strikingly different. But that's beside the point, I suppose. It was still nice to see the continuity that was trying to be established between the end of the first one and then the beginning of the second one, which is good too, because that's one thing that I really have to say about the Halloween films, which is I like how the use of the mask is a necessity in part 2, because it's a continuation from the first one. I never understood why Michael would use the same mask or the same type of mask in the subsequent films, to be perfectly honest. I'm a big fan of Halloween. I enjoy the films, but I never understood that. I never understood the need. I always thought he took the mask in the first film because it was a random mask that he'd found when he robbed a store or something like that. And so it was perfect for him. But then and then in Halloween 2, it was the same mask. And in fact, the Halloween 2 mask, I like it because it looks kind of rougher and meaner, because he seems really peeved because of all the events that ensued in part 1, and his attempts were thwarted by Dr. Loomis. And so if you think of what he went through in part 1, and then you think about what he goes through in part 2, you can understand perhaps how the mask in part 2, although it's supposed to be the same mask from part 1, still seems much angrier in terms of the expression, the William Shatner-esque expression. And so I like that. It's almost like the mask has a mind of its own in part 2, which I think is carried through quite brilliantly. But I never understood the practical need to use the exact or similar type of mask in the subsequent sequels where Michael Myers appears. So, but I understand from a marketing perspective and for the continuity of the character, I understand the need for the mask and the look. It's iconic. I get that. But I thought maybe if he used a different type of mask, it would have helped him to blend into the surroundings more, like, I don't know, like an alligator or maybe a bear or something like that. But still, don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of the Halloween films. What was I saying? Yes. So that was a mystery to me about how. I'm sorry. The continuity of the Halloween films, the first two, I thought was really impressive. I was always one too that I was always, I guess, when I was young, I loved the twist about Laurie and Michael and Michael's sister and Sam Hain and all that. I thought that was really a neat little twist, and it really gave this epic feel to the whole proceedings. But as I grew older, I found that I was always torn between either really loving what they did with the whole Michael's sister angle in part 2, and then actually preferring the horror of the randomness of part 1. So I always found myself going back and forth with that. Do I prefer the sister angle or do I prefer the random stranger angle? A stranger as in not an unknown to you, so stranger person. So I always went back and forth with that. But of course the sister angle spawned so many sequels, and it spawned the whole Jamie Lloyd plotline from part 4 onwards, which I actually find being a very strong plotline. I enjoy that plotline very much. But so I see a lot of worth and benefit to that plotline overall. But again, there's something very menacing and very chilling about the randomness, if you will, of the violence that ensues. Going back to that, therefore, Halloween 2 is therefore one of the scariest films for me, and the soundtrack is really adding to that effect. I just love the application of the synthesizer and the organ sound for use of the theme, and if you note there's a bit in the opening theme for the opening credits where the organ is used, and the organ almost goes overboard at the moment where it sort of enters in too early, and it kind of does an over stomping, if you will, and it goes like a big blah, which I found to be so apropos of the kind of chaos that is going to ensue in this film Halloween 2, because there's a lot of chaos that's going to ensue. It's really great. And Haddonfield too. I didn't realize, if you think about it, Haddonfield is supposed to be a very small town, and I thought it was great. But it's a small town, but it has a pretty big hospital. So I thought that was very interesting. Whenever I think of small towns, I always think that small towns will have little clinics or anything like that. But the hospital is quite big for a town of that size. At least that's what I'm thinking. That feels like a hospital that's maybe meant to be for a bigger city, I think. But it added to the ambience, and still, what a cool concept to bring the slasher element into this cold clinical area of a hospital at night where there's hardly anyone around. A very frightening concept indeed, and there's something, I think, for me anyway, very scary about empty hallways and corridors in a hospital setting. And so therefore that became part of the iconography of slasher films, and not just only setting them in these small towns, small Americana towns, but also setting them in these clinical places that have cold steel and white shiny hallways where there's very little room for hiding. And so I thought that was quite impressive indeed, as I'm sure many people did. And also with Halloween 3, I have to mention that Halloween 3 is I think one of the most brilliant works from this period ever. I will I will go down I will go down, to the very end defending Halloween 3, because that scared the living daylights out of me. I mean, there are two moments in particular, as you know. Well, there are many moments, in fact, but the the first moment was, of course, in the motel, and the lady there is checking out the little chip, and suddenly, boom, you don't quite know what's going on, and then you realize with the reveal that she's got some, like, it's suddenly a prosthetic or a puppet or something, of course, but it's just the grossness of it, and the whole thing with the, she's just like that, and that was a scary moment in the sound. But of course, the scary moment, the scariest moment in that is the little kid in the mask, and then suddenly everything just goes to chaos, and the bugs and everything, and the snakes and all that stuff just pouring out of his head. That is one of the most frightening moments. And I saw that as a kid, and I didn't quite expect it to turn out that way. It's part of I think, the charm and the genius of the song, the Silver Shamrock song. You listen to that song, and it's a really irritating jingle, but it sticks with you. And you hear it, you don't expect it to be associated with this kind of horror, let alone this horror that just comes seemingly out of nowhere, which is just bugs and snakes essentially bursting forth, erupting out of a little kid's head. So you think, my goodness, this is quite frightening. And it was, and that I remember crying when I saw that as a kid, because it freaked me out. It really freaked me out, because I liked Halloween. I wear masks. I like to watch TV wearing masks, and so all this stuff was something I think I could relate to. And then suddenly, my goodness, this little boy just said, bah! So that was something else. And I know I was not the only one who felt that way, but that moment it goes down in history for me as being one of the scariest moments of a film I've ever seen in my entire life. And so that became, therefore, linked in my mind as to the essential essence, if you will, of why that is for me one of the most iconic and deeply entertaining works. Tom Atkins, who is this kind of rock star in terms of this genre. He's been in so many classics, and here he is in what is one of his most heroic roles. And here he is. He's doing the thing that he does so well, and it's channeling a kind of panic mode disaster film, a la Invasion of the Body Snatchers, of course. Hitchcock comes to mind, of course. So you have all these great connections going forth, and connections between past and present. But of course, you also have the great music, the great sudden bursting forth of robots, and the Silver Shamrock myth, and this whole plot of killing kids, which is also very sinister. You have to remember that these films during this age had a pretty sinister edge to them. Really sinister. And I never really thought about it, because it was almost second nature with these sorts of films. But with the edge that this had, it was really quite brutal. But that added to the menace, and that's one thing when you have to feel when you're watching films like this, is there's a threat, there's a menace. And I think these films, Halloween 2 and Halloween 3 in particular, did that so well. Establishing the menace, establishing the threat, and then paying off everything that's been set up beautifully. So there's that. So yeah, Halloween 2 and Halloween 3 are gems in my own cinema journey that I cherish to this very day. And so anyone who feels the same way about Halloween 2 and Halloween 3, if you're out there, my friends, I guess in the spirit of, say, Cochrane in Halloween 3, just go like this, So Thank you very much for that. Again, one of these days, I really should try to focus my comments in a more lucid and more easily to understand way. But and I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do for Halloween, I suppose. But Halloween 2 and Halloween 3. There's that. And I guess also, I guess I should try to talk more about Halloween 4 and Halloween 5, because those are two very kindred spirits when it comes to the further expansion of the Halloween mythology and the Jamie Lloyd storyline, etc. But Daniel Harris. But I admit I go back and forth on Halloween 4 because I think I was, how should I put it? I kind of was, maybe if I were younger and I saw Halloween 4, I think it would have been one of my favorite Halloween films. But I think I maybe was a little bit too old by then. I wasn't old, but I was maybe starting to grow up. I think had I watched Halloween 4 at the same age that I saw Halloween 2 and Halloween 3, then it would have been much more effective to me. But as it happens, I think it's not I don't think it's a terrible film, but I think it's a very good film. But I do think that Halloween 2 and Halloween 3, well, Halloween 2 and Halloween 3 are the ones for me. I love the Halloween 4 trailer, the first trailer that I ever saw of Halloween 4. I just love that. I love that trailer so much. I might like the trailer a little bit more than I like the film itself. But sometimes that happens. That's the same with, I remember when I first saw the trailer for Alien 3, and that was mind-blowing, and I couldn't believe what was going to happen. Like, my goodness, this is going to be so cool. And then the film happened, and it needed room and time to grow. And there were many circumstances about that film that I'm sure those of you who know the Alien films will know very well. But that took time for me to get acclimated to. And I think a certain type of process occurred with Halloween 4 and Halloween 5 for me. Although I do admit that Halloween 5, I like where it was trying to go. And especially with the end, it's like, what the heck is going on with this ending? You had no idea what was going on. And then that led to the anticipation for the sixth film, very much so. And the sixth film I'm actually quite a fan of. And I like what they were doing, because this was the only place that you could go, I think, with the Halloween series, especially by the end of 5. And so I do like that, and it felt like it was going in a completely new direction, although hinted at in part 5, but then it was trying to link back to the first film and try to create this world and what we saw in the first and the second films. And so I liked what it was trying to do there. And I also like the almost the brutal beefiness of Michael in parts. I like that hulking presence that he has. So he's almost like a walking tombstone, which I think is so perfect for the character. I thought that was great. What was I saying? Oh yes. So and then H2O. H2O was one that I actually saw in the theater, and that was very exciting, and it filled me a lot of anticipation. But I liked the opening. I liked the opening very much. It reminded me a lot of Friday the 13th Part 2. And I liked how it was going, and I liked a little bit of what was going on. But I must admit that I think as time has passed, it has grown, it has fallen a little bit in terms of my own viewing of the Halloween films. And then Resurrection came, which was, I admit, to quite perplexing. And even now I try to grapple with it. And I will try to do so. It's like what does Khan say in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan? To the last I will grapple with thee. And so I will try to grapple with Halloween Resurrection, but we shall see. And then I think the Rob Zombie Halloweens, I think, deserve their own videos, because those are really quite nuanced and fascinating, in my own opinion. Are they my favorite Halloween films? That's subject to debate. But I think what they're trying to do is to really mold a kind of backstory and a depth in terms of a backstory, which I think works in large part. There are some still aspects of it that I'm grappling with as well. But those cycle of films, I think, are really doing things that are very almost experimental. So, and I admire the approach and the attempt at injecting a freshness to it while still maintaining a continuity, and that's not always easy to do. So, but one of these days I should talk more about those, because I do have a lot to say, I think, about those. Maybe when the opportunity arises, but one of these days, I would like to talk about that. But as I say, it goes back to, for me, ultimately, the first three films. And oh yes, and of course, I have the least amount of experience with the David Gordon Green film Halloween. I've seen it a number of times, but I admit I still need time, maybe a few more years, perhaps, to let it process more. I find it to be quite an interesting take, but ultimately, as I said, it goes back to me to those first three films, and I find that to be, in many ways, one of the most interesting trilogies in all of 80s horror cinema. So we have some of the great trilogies, and I think that falls into that. I think that and the Omen trilogy, I think are among some of the most sublime trilogies, actually. And perhaps they're not really trilogies because they're other films that came after those. But in terms of those three films, I think they stand up very, very well. And as I say, in terms of Halloween 3, this is probably the most perplexing third film in any trilogy, but that's one of its strengths, actually, and it's the quirkiness of the title and the what's going on with the plot, and what does it have to do with the other two films. That's one of the great charming aspects of this, because it's almost like it's like, what do you call it? It's the film's way of distracting you, because it's gonna be, it's sort of, oh, this is a Halloween film, where's Michael? And then bam, it just really assaults you with all these shocks and gross out effects that are very effective. They certainly were on me when I first saw that film, however old I was, in the early 80s. So anyway, that's just a little bit about Hollywood. But one of these days I should try to talk more about these films in more detail, but well, hopefully if time permits.